Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Robert Lieber. Robert is a professor emeritus of government and international affairs at Georgetown University and also a former Wilson Center public policy fellow. He's written or edited 18 books on U.S. foreign policy, including his latest, Indispensable Nation, American Foreign Policy in a Turbulent World. Bob, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I have fond memories of both my year as a public policy fellow, but also our earlier, a couple of decades before that, as a Wilson fellow, which is what first gave me entrance and exposure to the Wilson Center. And it's in the days it was in the castle.
We're always thrilled to welcome back a distinguished alum. And I should tell our viewers, when we talk about the castle, we're talking about the Smithsonian Castle, the original building, not Hogwarts or anything like that. So, Bob, let me ask you about the concept of indispensable. When you think of the United States in terms of indispensable, how would you define that?
The way I would define it, and it's a great question, I'm glad you asked, is that no other country or group of countries or international institution is capable of doing what the United States can do. Not the European Union, not the United Nations, not the Arab League, and so on and so forth. In the most urgent life and death matters, if the U.S. is not engaged in some way, not primarily sending in the Marines, but as in the case of the Ukraine war now, had the U.S. not decided to support the Ukrainians after Russia's vicious, unprovoked attack on February 24th of last year, in my judgment, there is no way the Europeans would have stuck their necks out to provide assistance to the Ukrainians for fear that they would be matched up against the Russian bear by themselves without the U.S. having their back. So indispensable means nobody else can do what the U.S. can do, whether it's in situations of war and peace, whether it's in matters of disease, technology, all kinds of areas of human life, economic life for that matter.
Speaking of definitions, the turbulent world is probably one that needs less definition for our viewers and listeners because we're all living it together. But I should note that you were finishing this book before the invasion of Ukraine, which just upped the ante on this notion of a turbulent world. If you were writing a new chapter today, would much change about your conclusions, or does the invasion and what you just gave as an example of indispensable only make your notion even more relevant in your own mind?
Russia's invasion of Ukraine strengthens and reinforces the argument I'm making in the book. To some people, the argument I make is controversial. To various voices on the left and right and among some cultural circles, the argument about some was, well, the international institutions, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and so on, handle or can handle these things better. Or international treaties, the UN Charter, which forbids exactly the kinds of things the Russians did last Feb 24, signed agreements in Europe, solemn signed agreements in any number of ways during the Cold War and after, which forbid that kind of conduct. And people might have said, well, it's true, you make a theoretical argument, but the world has changed. War is obsolete. There are political scientists who've written that. And we're past that. Well, we're not past it, alas. And the behavior of revisionist powers, China, with what it's done to the Uyghurs, how it's seized areas along its periphery, Iran, which has got its hands in 4 major nearby states through directly or through its proxies, and Russia, as we're seeing here, basically have simply run roughshod over all the existing international restrictions, restraints, and even, if you like, things that have been part of international law and international understanding, not just now, but for many centuries, even millennia. For example, treatment of captured prisoners. It's really not very nice to behead them. It also violates all kinds of rules of conduct that have been in place for centuries, but there's no one to enforce them.
Seems as if when anyone, a historian or anyone else, gets too far over their skis in proclaiming that we're at the end of something, that never seems to be the case. But one bit of conventional wisdom that has been making the rounds in recent years is the notion of a diminished U.S. role. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the U.S. at the end of World War II, in the early 1960s, and again after the end of the Cold War in 1990-91, had a level of power relative to the rest of the world that was absolutely prodigious. I've got a quote from 2002 from a leading British scholar, Paul Kennedy, who had written a book a few years earlier about the decline of great nations, great powers. And he implied that if the U.S. didn't watch its way, the U.S. would go the way of Great Britain. So this is just 5 years later. He's writing in an op-ed in the Financial Times. This is Paul Kennedy, distinguished British historian whom I respect, has written a lot of very good work. 2002, quote, "Nothing has ever existed like this disparity of power. Nothing. Charlemagne's empire was merely Western European in its reach. The Roman Empire stretched farther afield, but there was another great empire in Persia and a larger one in China. Today, there is therefore no comparison," unquote. Well, that was then. That was 2002. A lot has changed. A lot has changed since World War II. A lot has changed since the end of the Cold War. A lot has changed since 2011. But 2001, I should say, 9/11. So the U.S. no longer has the same relative advantages in size, military strength, and so forth over potential threatening powers or simply over other great powers. But the fact remains that no matter how you calculate it, except for population, in which the U.S. remains third after India and China, the U.S. tends to remain well ahead in all the other indicators by which we measure national power. Gross domestic product, for instance. The U.S. still to this day, despite all the talk of the Chinese economy, is about 24% of world GDP measured in dollar terms, market exchange rates. China, for all its achievements, is 18%. And the advantages China has had are slipping very rapidly. They're reaching the middle income trap, where it's a lot harder for countries to make huge advances after they've moved up from being way down to being middle income. And they're aging. They may get old, the saying goes, get old before they get rich. There are many other things that plague them, including a disastrous demographic tilt in terms of age and catastrophically low birth rates. So yes, the U.S. margin vis-a-vis others is less. The military capacity of our adversaries is a lot greater. And what I argue is we have to be prudent. We have to think when we talk about making interventions or trying to deal with situations, ask ourselves, what is it that we can do? What's our comparative advantage without getting overcommitted? After all, everyone looks back to Iraq and Afghanistan for various lessons they could or should draw. And my answer is, it's not always about sending the Marines. It's not about another Afghanistan. It's not about another World War II. But in numerous instances, we can exert great influence with others by being there in the negotiations, being there in the planning, being there in rallying allies and friends and others, and making sufficient commitments without overcommitting ourselves when our national interests and above all our values are at stake, as is the security of our neighbors and those who are our key allies, and finally, in terms of the type of world we want to live in. If we pull back, and I must be blunt, I wrote a book in 2012 called Retreat and Its Consequences about the Obama presidency. If you, actually 2016, I take that back. If you follow what Obama has been doing, what Trump has been doing, and what to some extent Biden, despite the courageous decisions he's made in Ukraine, although not assertive enough in my judgment under the critical circumstances, it's been implied right around the world. If you ask Asian leaders and thinkers, Middle Easterners, Europeans, others in Africa and Latin America, they will all say the U.S. is pulling back. The U.S. is withdrawing far more than we need to. The thing is to get our allies to do it. And we've been pushing to get our allies to do more. And they are doing more, especially in Europe and to some extent in Asia. But so there's a sweet spot there. And it's a serious mistake to say, oh, we can't do it. Let's pull back behind our two wonderful oceans. Well, as 9/11 reminded us, that won't do.
About that, I mean, the quote that you shared, in the 21 years or so that have passed since then, much has changed. And what you described is a lot of the rise of the rest, particularly of China.
Right.
But then you argue also, and some would argue, that there are self-inflicted wounds too, in terms of the U.S. standing in the world. And you mentioned Trump and Obama, two presidents that most people don't see many parallels between. But when it comes to foreign policy, maybe their tone was different. But you talk about in the book how fundamentally they were coming from a similar position as far as the U.S. pulling back to a certain extent. I think in the Obama years, it was leading from behind. In the Trump years, there wasn't perhaps such a catchphrase, U.S. first or America first or something like that. But it all ended up in a similar place where the U.S. was seen as being less willing to be the indispensable nation that you described.
Yeah. Under Obama was quoted at one point as saying that our policy should be, don't do stupid stuff. Footnote, he didn't use the word stuff, but I'm of a generation that doesn't think it's polite to use obscenity except under more extreme circumstances. Even Hillary, who was then thinking of running for president in 2016, said, don't do stupid stuff is insufficient as a grand strategy for the U.S. Obama's notable failure was in 2013, after Syria used poison gas against its own population, killing over 1,000 people in a suburb of Damascus. It broke through by Obama's red line, where he said if Syria did something like this, it would cross the red line. Everyone expected we were going to whack the Syrians, not send in the Marines, but it implied there would be missile strikes, other punitive actions, and so forth. Didn't happen. Nothing. And it sent a signal to the bad guys, to the revisionists, that we were pulling back. It also warned our allies who were becoming concerned about whether the U.S. really did have their back. Then, in the case of Biden, the pullout in Afghanistan was chaotic and it was a catastrophe. Our allies were not warned. It was exercised very poorly. I know all the arguments about people wanted us out and so on, but did the Afghans really want us out? The Afghan army collapsed, but we had pulled out the supports under them, the logistics, the mechanics to maintain the aircrafts, the medevac, and the rest. It could have been done far more efficiently and without getting two black eyes in the process. And I'll give you an example. Another example, the Iranian proxies have been running wild in the Middle East. Last year or the year before, they fired missiles at a major oil facility of Saudi Arabia, knocking out several million barrels of oil a day, production and distribution. Normally, the U.S. would have retaliated in some way, whacked the proxies the IRGC, for instance, or Iran itself to retaliate. No, we didn't lift a finger. And when the Saudis say to themselves, well, this was punishing, quote unquote, the Saudis because of the despicable killing of Khashoggi in the Saudi embassy in Turkey. Well, that was a terrible act that shouldn't have happened. But stop for a minute and compare the action of the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and the Iranians every day, the awful human rights actions they take, the mass murders, the affronts to humanity, the treatment of women, the everyday violations of these things. Yes, the Saudis deserved a slap on the wrist, but Biden referred to Saudi Arabia as a pariah and then did things like pull out missile defense from there, pull back from there, when in fact, this was under a crown prince who was making Saudi Arabia do what American leaders have been asking Saudi Arabia to do for the last 30 years, modernize, do stuff to end the domination by the religious police, do more in your defense spending, give a greater role to women, join the modern economy. They were doing a lot of this stuff in ways that were unprecedented. And here, instead of paying attention to the bigger picture, we stuck our thumb in their eye. What are they? So when you say, why in the world are they cozying up to the Chinese and the Iranians now? The answer is they feel they can't rely on the United States anymore. Same thing, you say the Indians and the Turks and the Indonesians ought to be our supporters, especially on the divide over policy toward China and toward Ukraine, but their hesitation is very much due to the hesitation we've shown. An uncertain trumpet, people do not like to follow one.
After the Cold War, when the U.S. was sitting in the catbird seat, how much of the world we're living in today and the conundrums that you're describing are a function of the decisions taken or not taken at the end of the Cold War?
It was a very unnatural situation where the U.S. was in such a dominant position, and a lot of opportunities were missed. There was a wonderful increase in the number of representative democracies, in globalization, in the ending of regional and internal conflicts, and so forth. But for various reasons, including a lot of these internal conflicts, civil wars in particular, are very hard to resolve. And you have to break it down to every region and case. We don't have anywhere near the time to discuss that. And a lot of things were missed. Bill Clinton saw this as a kind of the appearance of a global village. And the US in 1999 dissolved the United States Information Agency, one of the most catastrophic decisions in cultural policy any nation has ever made. USIA, though imperfect, was this large organization that ran the Voice of America, American libraries, student abroad programs that brought foreigners here, both kids, young people, students, and senior officials, to get a view of what the US was like and learn things about modernity and democracy, and sent our kids and our artists and intellectuals abroad to speak. We're getting collaborated in the disinformation war by the lies of Russia and China and Iran and others, because once USIA was dissolved, putting a weak replacement for it in the State Department was a failure. That bureau and its sub-bureaus has been leadership in the majority of the time since it was created. And we just basically gave it up. That's the kind of pointless thing I have in mind, because people will say when I talk about Indispensable Nation, say, well, you're just talking about intervening everywhere to make the world safe for democracy. Wilson, you're just talking about sending our troops everywhere there's a problem. You're talking about trying to solve every civil war. No, I'm not trying to do that at all. There's certain places like the Congo and maybe Sudan where there's really not much you can do practically. But you have to say, where do we have a comparative advantage? Where do we have tools we can use? Where can we do things at an acceptable cost that affect our and our allies' security, our values, and avoid a world in which China, for instance, becomes the leading power. Look at the treatment of the Uyghurs. Look at China's demand for deference from countries on its periphery. A lot of them are scared of China and only cozy up to it because they're afraid what would happen if the US and others don't support them.
About that, in the book you write about what if the US abdicates and the alternatives to the US's alternative nation, and you've talked about that a bit today. Expand on that notion about how high are the stakes if the US does not accept the challenge that you're putting forward, that it not only remain the indispensable nation, but make moves to enhance that position.
Yeah. I love that question. Let me just say briefly, the book argues three key questions, research questions. One, are we still indispensable given all the changes that occurred? Short answer, yes. Question two, do we still have the capability to do that? Short answer, maybe. We have the international capability, the material capability, but do we have the will, the social cohesion, the cultural support? And there I've got a quote somewhere in which I attack the mindless 1619 project of the New York Times, which basically says the US is a systemic racist society beyond redemption. And it completely falsely describes American history. Slavery was a horrible evil, which was extirpated. And it took another 100 years to provide genuine civil and political rights for Black people. We're still coping with that. But if you tell an entire generation that the US is a racist imperialist nation without hope, then why in the world would they support American engagement or leadership in the world? You can't do that. So that struggle is being fought out and so on. But the third question is, if because of foreign or material or cultural factors, we cannot play a significant leadership role abroad, not domination, but primus inter pares, first among equals, so to speak, then you're turning over leadership, domination, influence to the revisionist states, bitter dictatorships, imperialist countries. Bluntly, Iran, Russia, and China are imperialist in the old-fashioned sense. They are, I mean, people talk about the US and colonialism. Wow, just completely wrong. And the kinds of things that the Russians are doing in Ukraine and did earlier on their periphery in Georgia and other places, and will do elsewhere, probably in the Baltic countries, if they prevail in Ukraine. They're trying to restore their influence over the old empire, not necessarily bring it fully within their borders, but making sure those regimes do what they say. China's in a similar situation. They also want to dominate their region. And as an example, when countries have made the faintest criticisms or questions about, say, the origins of COVID, unanswered, they've done things like attack the Australians and demand they rewrite their laws to restrain newspapers from criticizing them. They cut off certain important exports by the Australians to China for a time. They've attacked Lithuania, which at one point had recognized Taiwan, and Lithuania dropped out of this deal that the Chinese have with the East European countries, or quickly saying that it's a scam. Russia's treatment, China's treatment of the Uyghurs, and the Orwellian social control the Chinese are putting in effect is Stalinism, Orwellianism, in a 21st century model, using the most advanced computer and imaging and artificial techniques to keep track of every aspect of life in China and keep an accounting of each individual. And their international deals they cut are often highly corrupt and typically bribe the people they who deals with and so forth. So it's an ugly world in store if we don't do at least what we're capable of And those are the stakes. They're very high, as visible in Ukraine right now.
The former National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, said this about the book. In recent decades, the emotional impetus behind American foreign policy has vacillated between over-optimism combined with complacency and pessimism combined with resignation. Bob Lieber makes a strong case for a reasoned and sustainable approach to international challenges and opportunities. And you did that again today, Bob. Thank you for joining us. Great to have you back at the Wilson Center, even if just virtually. And congratulations on the book, which is Indispensable Nation, American Foreign Policy in a Turbulent World.
Yale University Press. Buy the book.
That's right. Don't use our cliff notes just from today. That's the extra added bonus, right? Read the book. Read the book.
As every author will tell you, there's a phase in which an author is involved in shameless publicity. And I advocate among my most erudite friends, they keep that in mind for themselves when they publish. So thanks very much for this discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Same here. And nothing wrong with a little self-promotion when you have important information to share. Thanks, Bob.
I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Our guest has been Bob Lieber. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for everyone at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for your time and interest.